Many people think that Ruth Ellis is the victim. She's not the victim. She's a cold-blooded killer.
I feel an enormous sympathy for her because I feel that she was a victim of her time.
As far as the law was concerned, she pulled the trigger, she killed a man in cold blood, and therefore she should be found guilty and hanged.
In 1955, a murder was committed outside this pub at Hampstead in London. The victim was David Blakeley, and what made his killing so shocking was that his attacker had been his lover, Ruth Ellis. What I want to know is what would drive a woman to hunt down and kill in cold blood the man that she loved, and just how responsible was she for her actions? I'm Fred Downage, and I'm the official biographer of the Cray twins. Well, in 1955, I was just a teenager when the case of Ruth Ellis hit the headlines. I still remember the story. It provoked a national outcry. Even today, the murder Ruth committed and the punishment she received divides public opinion. Her name remains in the history books as the last woman to be hanged in Britain. Ruth Ellis was born Ruth Nielsen in Rhyl, North Wales, on the 9th of October 1926. She was one of 6 children brought up in a traditional working-class family. Her father, Arthur, was a jobbing musician, and as a family, they followed him around the country. Sadly, most of the people involved in the Ruth Ellis case have now passed away. But there's one man who interviewed several key witnesses for a book he co-wrote in 1977. He's the award-winning writer Lawrence Marks. We're actually, Lawrence, in the bar of the Magdala Public House in Hampstead. Let's go back to Ruth Ellis's childhood, her young life. What sort of life was it?
She was a bit rebellious, a difficult child. She was not academically gifted in any way, and the family tended to move around. I mean, the life of her father really dictated how the family lived. When he was in work, they lived fairly well, and when he wasn't, which was quite a lot of the time, things were very, very difficult.
Ruth left school at the age of 14 and moved with her family to the heart of London, where she found work in a factory. It was wartime, but far from restricting Ruth, it gave her a new lease of life. The mousy brown girl dyed her hair blonde. By the age of 16, she was beginning to frequent the dance halls. It was here that she was to meet her first boyfriend.
Well, Ruth was a very keen social dancer, and on this particular evening in 1943, she met a Canadian soldier, not what you would call attractive, but probably with a very full wallet. And they danced, and I think their relationship developed, and it was really Ruth's first love.
I've arranged to meet a lady who was brought up surrounded by the nightclubs and dance halls of London. Author Pip Granger has made a study of the life of Ruth Ellis and can give me a real insight into what actually went on.
I mean, she was 16, 17, she was dazzled. It was something she'd never come across before. And all the glamour in the ballrooms, you know, the glitter ball, the lovely frocks, because it was a time when English girls had had 6 years of war, no money. They were using gravy browning instead of stockings to make their legs look dark, and, you know, they couldn't afford nylons. So it would have been extremely glamorous to her.
10 years older than Ruth, Canadian Claire Andre introduced Ellis to the luxuries she was far from used to. He sent her carnations and would wine and dine her in the restaurants of Soho.
Claire told her that he really would like to marry her. And Ruth was probably exceedingly flattered that this man in uniform would want to give his life to this young blonde woman.
Ruth's life changed forever at the age of 17 when she fell pregnant. Claire Andre's promises of marriage were revealed to be nothing more than false hope.
What Ruth didn't know, of course, and she didn't get to know this until some investigation into his background was conducted by, of all people, her mother, was that Claire was married with children in Canada. Ruth experienced for the first time rejection and how easily she could fall in love. And I think how easily she could fall in love really was the thread that ran through this story.
At the age of 17, Ruth had a baby boy whom she named Claire Andrea Nielsen. She was now a mother with a child out of wedlock, frowned upon by others. Ruth made a conscious decision she wasn't going to be a victim. She wanted to take control of her life. Leaving her baby boy in the care of her family, she went back into the heart of London in search of work.
She would have had a real trouble getting a job. So she ended up applying for and getting a job at the camera club, which involved her posing naked.
You know, men used to go down to this club with their cameras. Few had film in them, I ought to say. And she would just disrobe and sit there in a static pose and be photographed by men. And she knew that the movement of her body, the eye contact, her youth, her pertness, could affect men. And I think that was the first time she really, really discovered that she had this control over men.
Ellis's striking blonde looks and newfound sexuality had financial benefits. She was soon offered employment as a hostess at the Court Club in London.
Many believe it was a combination of events during Ruth's life that caused her to commit murder. One man who studied what it takes to drive people to kill is criminologist Professor David Wilson.
Ruth Ellis is making very conscious decisions about the kind of lifestyle that she wants. So we can almost see her journey from Rill to London, from London into factories. She becomes a photographer's model, she takes her clothes off, and from there it's actually a relatively short step to work in Mayfair nightclubs as a hostess.
She was responsible for selling drinks at exorbitant prices. I'm told that cider looks like champagne in a flute and you can charge 3 guineas for it. That's what you did.
She was an incredibly hard worker. You know, when she was working in Woolworths in Brixton, she was earning £2 a week. When she was working in the clubs as a hostess, she was taking home £20 a week. Well, we mustn't try and think that this is somehow a poor woman who's kind of blinded by the lights, the glitter, the glamour, the glitz of London. This is somebody who's very consciously making a decision that she can earn more money, provide better for her family, and she can be the person that she wants to be.
The role of hostess involved more than selling drink. Ruth earned extra money by having sex with the clients of the Court Club.
She started as a nude model at the camera club. But once she'd done that, she crossed an invisible line. So it wasn't a really big step then for taking money for something that I think she quite enjoyed. I mean, I think she liked sex in a time when women weren't supposed to.
Ruth was leaving behind the life of poverty she'd experienced as a child. Her ability to make money from her clients enabled her to move on and become manager of the Mayfair hotspot, the Little Club. This seemingly glamorous life wasn't easy, though. Ruth underwent several illegal abortions during her time working as a hostess.
Ruth had made it clear that she would never get personally involved with any of the gentlemen that visited her club. However, one man proved persuasive in changing her mind. George Ellis was a dentist who regularly frequented the club. He was 21 years older than Ruth and infatuated with her.
As with all of Ruth's love interests, things weren't quite what they seemed. George was an alcoholic.
There's a sense in which George Ellis is an older man, alcoholic, dependent upon her. She must have felt in some way that she could control that relationship better than she'd been able to control the relationship with Claire Andrea, who had abandoned her.
Ruth married George Ellis at a registry office in Tunbridge in Kent. Two unsuspecting passers-by were the only witnesses to the ceremony.
They have a child, Georgina, although George Ellis denies that Georgina could be his. He thinks that Ruth Ellis has clearly been sleeping around. Alternatively, Ruth Ellis thinks that he's been sleeping around. So we're back to this sense in which she doesn't trust the men in her lives.
The marriage would only last for a year, and it wasn't George's alcoholism that would split them up. Ruth's jealousy was to blame.
She was pathologically jealous. I mean, when George Ellis was taken into Wallingham Park, which was a drying out hospital, really, for alcoholics, Ruth got it into her head, for no good reason, that George, far from drying out, was having affair after affair with nurses in Wallingham Park, and she used to stake out the hospital.
By 1951, the Ellis marriage had disintegrated, even though Ruth was pregnant. She left George less than a year after their wedding day, and Ruth's dreams of a life of security were in tatters. But it wouldn't be long until she met the man who would be the love of her life, and ultimately, her downfall. I'm Fred Dinage, and I'm investigating the case of Ruth Ellis. I want to know what made her shoot down the man she loved in cold blood.
The blonde-haired nightclub hostess caused controversy when she became the last woman to be hanged in Britain.
So she'd had 2 children, she'd been divorced, and despite everything, she still returned to being a hostess and leading a life in the clubs. Why would she do that? Was it money?
Well, I think by that stage, she's been given this glimpse of the lifestyle that she could lead by working in this way. So of course she's going to return. It's a very conscious decision to return. And once you've cut off your roots, once you've said, I don't want that past, I want something different, could you really go back to that past? Could you really go back with your tail between your legs? Ruth Ellis wasn't somebody to look backwards. Ruth Ellis was somebody who wanted to look forwards.
Ruth's role as a nightclub hostess gave her the opportunity to party with the motor racing fraternity. It was amongst this group of young playboys that she met the man she would go on to kill. His name was David Blakeley.
On first seeing David Blakeley, Ruth said, "In strolled David wearing a coat and flannel trousers. I did not like his manner from the start. I thought he was too hoity-toity by far."
She rather hoped she'd never meet him again, but he turned up at her club, I think, and they were still a bit cool towards each other because she didn't like his behaviour, but within a month he was living with her and living off her.
David Blakeley was 3 years younger than Ruth. He came from a wealthy family and had been left £7,000 when his father died. He spent the majority of his time working on sports cars and had an ambition to become a professional racing driver.
She was a groupie in many ways. Yeah. I mean, she was a groupie before her time. And she latched onto this guy, and she was taken by his voice, his good looks, and his desire, I suspect, to be a racing driver, which she saw as being quite glamorous.
Here's the kind of man that she feels she deserves. Here's the kind of man who's aspirational for this girl, this strictly brought up girl from Rhyl in Wales.
But looks can be deceiving. Blakeley's inability to keep a job and his obsession with motor racing drained his inheritance. His drinking increased. He was soon left penniless. He relied on Ruth to provide him with free booze at her club and also her bed for the night.
It was one of those awful sort of cyclical relationships. Grand passion, great lust, followed by extreme violence, huge makings up, and back on the old treadmill again. Neither of them understood each other or themselves.
Ruth and David's relationship wasn't monogamous. Ellis continued to work as a hostess, providing sexual services to the men who visited her club. Blakeley, already engaged to an heiress, spent time with various women. This complicated arrangement caused jealousy and led to violent fights.
It was a stormy relationship on both sides. Ruth Ellis, when she was drinking, could be very violent herself. Blakeley was clearly very violent to her, but she was particularly jealous of him. She was incredibly possessive.
David took Ruth to race meetings and exclusive parties. But David's friends weren't impressed by the blonde-haired woman who hung on his arm. One couple who frowned upon the relationship were David's friends, the Findlaters.
They kind of mothered and fathered him, and they just thought that this blonde manageress at the little club was not the sort of girl that they wanted to see him with. So they, in time, started talking him out of the relationship. You know, she's a good screw, that's really what she is. So screw her and get rid of her.
By 1954, David Blakeley was having a negative impact on Ruth's lifestyle. The owner of the club made her pay extra rent because Blakeley was living with her. It was then that Ruth took up with another man, Desmond Cusson. At 33, he was a few years older than Ruth, and many believe he would play an integral role in the murder of David Blakeley.
Here was a man who I think genuinely loved her. He cared for her. Nothing was too much for Cusson where Ruth was concerned. And Ruth really appealed to him. I can imagine why. I mean, again, she was very good looking and she was very kind to him. And he, in turn, was very kind to her. In fact, the only man I suspect in her life, including her father, that treated her like a woman. And, but there was Blakeley. And Blakeley was the excitement and Cusson was the reliability. And at 26, 7 years old, you don't want reliability.
She always had to be the centre of attention. She didn't. And whenever Blakeley looked as if he was straying a bit, which he did with monotonous regularity, she would use Desmond Cousins to goad him, you know, to make him jealous.
Ruth's plan to make Blakeley jealous worked. He ended his engagement with the heiress and began to talk to Ruth about marriage. It was exactly what she hoped would happen. But this didn't end the violent, jealous rows or stop Ruth from seeing her alternate lover, Desmond Cusson.
She treated Cusson badly, didn't she?
She treated Cusson, in my opinion, as badly as Blakeley treated her. And this became a very dangerous triangle because in the middle was Ruth, and on one side was unreliable excitement that at any minute could flare up and punch her in the face in front of people. I mean, this wouldn't be done in private. And there, sitting there, was a man who could give her really everything that would have suited her life, watching and thinking, why is that man there, who I hate the sight of, hitting the woman I love full in the face with his fist and kicking her in the stomach?
Their relationship spiraled out of control. It was affecting Ruth's job. She was given an ultimatum by her boss to choose between her career as a hostess or her lover, Blakeley. She chose Blakeley. In doing so, she became homeless. Desmond Cusson saw his opportunity and offered her the chance to move in with him. With no other choice, she accepted.
When Blakeley drank her and misbehaved her, really, out of her job, she was homeless. Cousins gave her a home, gave her an income, and would allow, and this I can't understand, allow Blakeley to come and visit and sleep with her in his flat. I've often wondered if he might be a voyeur, but there's been no evidence of that. It's just that he was besotted and he was prepared to go to any lengths to keep hold of her. So he would drive her all over the place looking for Blakeley when she was in one of her jealous rages.
In 1955, Ruth told Blakeley she was pregnant. Nobody knows if she planned to keep the baby, but the pregnancy ended in tragedy.
It was in late March that David and Ruth had yet another violent row. It was then, according to Ruth, that David punched her in the stomach. Days later, she miscarried.
The love triangle came to a head during Easter 1955. David Blakeley had promised to spend the weekend with Ruth. She dressed for an evening out, but he didn't turn up. Fueled by Pernod, Ruth's jealousy began to rise. She thought she'd track Blakeley down to his friend's house, the Finlaters.
She made endless phone calls to the Finlaters' house. And they either ignored her, insulted her. She turned up at the house. They wouldn't let her in. She had a feeling that he was knocking off their nanny.
Again, it's all about jealousy. It's all about possession. It's all about the sense in which Ellis feels that she's going to be abandoned. You start with a Canadian serviceman, you go on through George Ellis, you go on through David Blakeley, and therefore this anxiety, this worry that here again is another man who's prepared to leave her.
Ruth damaged David's car outside the Finlaters in an attempt to bring him out of hiding. It failed. The police were called and persuaded a furious Ellis to go home. As she was driven away by Desmond Cusson, she made the deadly decision that would change her and David Blakeley's lives forever.
I'm Fred Dinage, and I'm investigating what drove Ruth Ellis to kill her lover, David Blakeley, here outside the Magdala pub in London.
Just what were the events that led to this tragic case that resulted in Ruth being the last woman to be hanged in Britain? The year was 1955, and nightclub hostess Ellis had been abandoned by her long-term lover, David Blakeley. Fueled by alcohol and in a jealous rage, she made the decision she wanted him dead. It's alleged it was at this point she turned towards her alternate lover, Desmond Cusson, for help.
What I now know to have happened next was they left in Cusson's car to somewhere like Burnham Beeches. I think it was Burnham Beeches. And Cusson produced a loaded gun. And he's taught Ruth how to fire a gun with the view to killing Blakeley, because Ruth had professed a desire to shoot the bastard, quite frankly.
It was Easter Sunday. Since Good Friday, David Blakeley had been hiding from a frantic Ellis. Now she set out to hunt him down.
For 3 days, Ellis has been drinking, taking tranquilizers, is in a heightened emotional state. The adrenaline would be running through her veins. Cusson is going to drive her to the pub. We don't know. What is Cusson saying to her as he's driving her to the pub? This is a man who's shown her how to fire the weapon, has loaded the weapon for her. Is he encouraging her as they reach the pub in Hamstead? Is he saying, oh, don't be daft, you know, let's just drive on? Or is he in fact propelling Ruth Ellis to go forward with her plan of shooting David Blakeley?
She discovered Blakeley's car parked outside the Magdala pub in Hampstead, London. As she peered through the window of the pub, she saw he was inside, drinking with a friend.
He then paid for his drink, walked out the door over there, outside, and there was Ruth standing with a Smith & Wesson loaded, 6 bullets in the barrel. And she called David. And David looked round and saw Ruth with a gun in her hand.
Blakeley's first instinct was to run, but he didn't get far. Ruth pulled the trigger. She fired 2 shots, and then a third that cut him down. Ruth coolly walked up to David's body and emptied 2 more shots into him. Blakeley lay dying. With her mission accomplished, she then turned the gun on herself, but the gun jammed.
By this time, a crowd had gathered, and it just so happened that a member of the crowd was an off-duty policeman. And she turned to him and said, "Call the police." And he said the immortal line, "I am the police." And she handed in the gun and gave herself up quietly.
I've worked with a number of murderers, and even if the adrenaline is pumping through their veins, once they achieve the kill, they're almost deflated, they're almost flat. And I do get that impression that Ruth Ellis had achieved what she wanted to achieve, and that was all she wanted to achieve. So yes, please arrest me. I've done what it is I set out to do.
Professor David Wilson has arranged an experiment to demonstrate the emotions that would have faced Ruth Ellis on the night of the murder.
So Fred, I've brought you to the National Shooting Centre in Bisley. Have you ever fired a gun before?
Never fired a gun in my life. In fact, to be honest, never held one, really.
Gun culture is not really part of British culture, but here we are in a legitimate place where you can fire, for the first time, a gun. I'm trying to recreate Easter Sunday, 1955. Ruth Ellis goes to the Magdala pub in Hampstead, and she's going to shoot and kill David Blakeley. So what I would like to see you is obviously shoot the gun and ask you about the power that it took to pull the trigger. I want to know how you felt when you have done that. Obviously we can't use the gun that Ruth Ellis would have used, which was a .38 Smith & Wesson. We're not allowed to use that type of weapon since Dunblane, but this is the closest we can get to the type of firearm she would have used. So I want to see you shoot this at that target.
Okay.
I think you've hit the target. Shall we go and see?
Yes.
So how did that feel?
The gun is ever so heavy, but it's feather-light, the trigger. The moment you touch the trigger, bang.
But you've never fired a gun before.
No.
What sort of emotions were you going through?
When it fires, an incredible sensation of power. Power, you know, that big bang and the smoke. And having done that, you want to carry on firing.
The adrenaline running?
Yes.
Imagine if you had been drinking Pernod. Imagine if you'd been taking tranquilizers. Imagine if it was your lover that had just dumped you.
I can understand how it happened for Ruth Ellis.
And of course, women, by and large, don't murder people in this way. They usually use poison, they use other types of ways of killing their victims. So here we've got a woman at the edge of a nervous breakdown almost, firing at her lover.
Well, this is where David Blakeley was murdered, outside the Magdala pub in London, shot by Ruth Ellis. It must have been a truly horrific occasion. I'm about to meet a witness of the aftermath. His name, Martin Hart. You were here that fateful Easter Sunday night. Tell me what happened.
I was 8 years old and I was walking home with my father past Hampstead Heath Station and into South Hill Park when we heard the shots. It sounded like a car backfiring. And my father brought me up the road and we saw Blakeley's body lying there with the blood pumping out of him. And I think my father forgot I was with him because he went over to see if he could do anything. And I saw Ruth Ellis being taken into the pub.
What were your impressions of Ruth Ellis, a striking lady?
She looked as cool as a cucumber. She looked relieved somehow. It's as though what she'd intended to do was finished with and it was over.
I mean, you were an 8-year-old boy at the time. How did it all affect you? Were you shocked?
It dawned on me, oh, it isn't just a game. So something real has happened.
Ruth was taken to Hampstead police station, telling the police she was guilty and a little confused. Within hours, she made a confession outlining how she'd set out to kill Blakeley. At no point did she mention Desmond Cusson. When asked where she got the gun, Ruth told the police she'd been given it by one of her clients from the club to pay off a debt. Ruth Ellis was charged with the murder of David Blakeley. If found guilty, she would face the death penalty.
As far as Ruth was concerned, at the moment she was arrested by PC Allen Thompson and taken to Hampstead police station, which is 3 minutes away from here. She had no desire to live at all. She had killed the man she loved, and now she wanted to be with him. So the quicker she could die, the better.
The judge allocated to her trial was Lord Justice Cecil Havers. His daughter, Baroness Butler-Sloss, has agreed to talk to me about his involvement.
He was very much of the old school, of course they say, born in the Victorian era. He was a kind man. He was entirely fair. He had very clear guidelines as to how judges should behave. And he was a traditionalist, so he applied the law as he thought the law was.
On the 20th of June 1955, Ruth Ellis stood trial for the murder of David Blakeley at the Old Bailey. It was up to Ruth to convince the jury that she didn't know what she was doing when she killed Blakeley. But Ruth Ellis was unwilling to play the role of victim.
Ruth had re-dyed her hair platinum blonde to the horror of her solicitors. As she was brought into the courtroom, members of the gallery were shocked, and one was even heard to exclaim, "Tart."
I think one problem was that she was dressed as a hostess, I think, in court, with peroxided hair, which in those days was not so usual. She had a career which was of a certain type of woman, and therefore she was much less likely to have public sympathy.
They'd have called her a brassy blonde, and it's no accident that the slang for a prostitute at the time was brass, because people who dyed their hair must be loose women in those days. And she would have been seen as a glamour puss, and therefore a glamour puss would automatically be seen as a girl with loose knicker elastic.
Ruth initially wanted to plead guilty, but her defence believed there were mitigating circumstances that had led her to kill Blakeley. When she finally took to the stand, she pleaded not guilty. Her trial would last only 2 days and proved to be one of the most controversial in British legal history.
I'm Fred Dinage, and I'm re-examining the events that led to Ruth Ellis killing her lover in 1955.
Why did her hanging lead to a change in the law and contribute to the end of capital punishment? The murder trial at the Old Bailey lasted for just 2 days. Ruth pleaded not guilty. Her defence's aim was to persuade the jury that Ruth hadn't been of sound mind when she pulled the trigger. However, in 1955, diminished responsibility wasn't on the statute book. All they could hope for was for Ellis to be found guilty of manslaughter.
Her defence was pretty meagre, to say the least. Various issues did not come out at court that might have put the circumstances of her life in a better context. We might have heard more about the tranquilizers that she was using. We might have heard more about the baby that she lost. So there was quite a lot that didn't come out at court that probably would have helped her.
The court called Desmond Cusson. His testimony would be crucial in determining Ruth's guilt.
He should probably have been in the dock with Ruth Ellis. He provides her with the gun. He loads the gun for her. He shows her how to fire the gun. He drives her to the Magdala pub. And of course, in the background, Cusson has been this love rival for Ellis's affection.
Desmond Cusson was questioned by the prosecution about his relationship with Ruth Ellis. He admitted they were lovers. The defence lawyer's cross-examination was surprisingly short. His questioning focused on whether Cusson had ever seen bruising on Ruth's body. He confirmed he had. At no point was he asked about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, or if he'd provided Ruth with the gun.
Many believe it was Ruth Ellis's own testimony that sealed her fate. When asked by the prosecution what she intended to do when she fired the gun, she replied, "It's obvious, when I shot him, I intended to kill him." Was your father, do you recall, surprised that she hadn't made more of a defence?
I think he couldn't quite believe it was such a straightforward case. But he applied the law. And his job was to tell the jury what the law was and the facts. The facts were extremely simple. She had a gun, she'd been given it, and she shot her lover, absolutely out in the open in the street. And once the jury had that information and no mitigating circumstances, they had to convict.
The jury took just 23 minutes to come to a decision. They found Ruth Ellis guilty. Mr. Justice Havers sentenced Ruth to death by hanging. She calmly accepted her fate.
There was a very cold, quiet sort of feeling in court. Nobody moved. Absolute silence when the death penalty was pronounced.
The press and public took up her case. A petition signed by 50,000 people was handed to the Home Secretary. They didn't think this woman should be executed for murdering her lover. Some questioned whether a woman could even be responsible for such a premeditated crime. I want to know why so many people supported a convicted killer. Professor David Wilson has a psychological experiment to explain why people find it so hard to believe that a woman can kill.
A boy and his father are driving on the M25, and unfortunately there's a dreadful accident and the boy's father dies. Luckily, the ambulance gets to the car crash quickly enough to stabilize the boy and take him to the nearest hospital. As he's being wheeled into the operating theatre for emergency surgery, the surgeon stops and says, "I'm sorry, I can't conduct this operation. This boy is my son." What's going on in that story?
I honestly haven't got a clue. He's my son,
Yes.
and yet his father was in the car crash with
Yes.
him. And his father has died.
His father has died.
Mistaken identity.
No,
But he can't be his son because his father, the father of the boy, is dead. So how can his father be the surgeon?
well, Fred, you're not the only person who argued that. I've been asking lots of people the same question I've just asked you, and just watch what they say as well.
To be honest, no idea.
No, I don't.
No. Got no idea at all.
No idea. Unless a surgeon's like a god or something like that.
Stepfather, possibly?
I have no idea. No, I don't know.
I'm none the wiser.
The surgeon says, "I can't conduct this operation because this boy's my son," because that is his mother. The surgeon is a woman, and the gender assumption is, as soon as I said surgeon, you thought man.
What does that tell you about me and my thought process?
Well, it tells me this, because these people were told the answer in the way that I've just told you, and here's what they said.
Yeah, okay. I just assumed it was a man.
You automatically think surgeon's going to be a man?
Well, yeah, I guess, yeah, a little bit wrong for me to assume, but, yeah. Of course a woman can be a surgeon.
So we all assumed the same thing and we were all wrong. Why did we do that?
Well, the key thing was what the last interviewee said. Of course a woman can be a surgeon, and of course a woman can be a killer.
Only a day before her execution, Ruth was persuaded to appeal. she revealed the extent of Desmond Cusson's role in the murder of Blakeley. The call was put out from the Home Office to find Cusson.
Cusson must have been in a state of absolute panic. He went into hiding and they never found him, and at midnight they called off the search and Ruth was doomed.
At 9 a.m. on the 13th of July 1955, prisoner number 9656 was taken to the gallows. Ruth Ellis was hanged for the murder of David Blakeley. She was the last woman in Britain to be put to death.
On June the 21st, Ruth Ellis was found guilty of murder at the Old Bailey and sentenced to death in accordance with the law. On July the 13th, she was executed in accordance with the law. But Britain's conscience was uneasy. During those 3 weeks, while public controversy mounted, one man had a terrible decision to make, Home Secretary William Lloyd George. As he went about his public duties, he had to decide whether or not to write the grim words, "The law must take its course." But in the end, he had no choice. As the law stands, and as precedent dictates, Ruth Ellis had to die. For the hundreds who waited at Holloway Jail on execution morning, and for the millions who stayed away, 3 questions remain. Should a woman hang? Should anyone hang at all? Or should there be degrees of murder?
Ruth was executed by the famous hangman Albert Pierpoint. He had concerns about hanging Ruth and told them later to Lawrence Marks.
He said to me that she gave me the sort of smile I would have expected had I gone down to the Little Club, a welcoming smile. And I didn't feel right about hanging this woman. Not because I thought she was innocent, but because there was something fundamentally wrong. And he could never quite put his finger on it, but I do know he wrote his letter of resignation after that execution.
After she was hanged, Desmond Cusson moved to Australia. In the UK, the impact of Ruth Ellis's death eventually played a part in changing the legal system.
She changed 2 laws, really. She contributed hugely to the abolition of capital punishment. The year after she was hanged, the defence of diminished responsibility was put on the statute books because it was obvious to everybody that she was not in her right mind. However calm she might have appeared, she was not in her right mind.
It's a sad story in a way, isn't it?
It is. It is. I've got enormous sympathy for Ruth Ellis because she just didn't have the self-awareness to be able to drag herself out of the mire she'd got herself in. And I think the only way out was to kill herself. And being a good Catholic girl, she couldn't do that, so she let the hangman do it for her.
I don't think this was a woman that ever harmed anybody in her life and probably would never have harmed anybody again in her life, except for that moment of madness. Were she here sitting with us today, would have said it wasn't madness, Lawrence, it was excessive provocation.
At the root of the Ruth Ellis story is this idea of gender assumption, the idea that we have to justify how women might kill because the balance of their mind is temporarily disturbed or because it's a crime of passion. Nonsense. It's just that some women can be violent.
Because of Ruth Ellis, the phrase crime of passion is used in our everyday parlance. The law now takes into account the circumstances leading up to and surrounding an act of murder within the context of a relationship.
You have to remember, crime always has a victim. But in the case of convicted murderer Ruth Ellis, well, some would say she was just as much a victim as David Blakeley, the lover she killed.